Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, You Shall Have No Other Gods, the Book of Exodus. Today we'll be talking about Lesson 6 of our study, which covers the Book of Exodus, Chapter 6. This lesson serves narratively as a transition point, right? We've been dealing with, for lack of a better phrase, Moses' conversion, right? And working things out with God, and the idea that, how that's going to affect the people and what's going to happen with Pharaoh and all of that has been secondary, like a secondary aspect or element of the Moses-God relationship. Now that we kind of are getting that core established, right? We work through Moses' excuses and his connection and budding relationship with God. Now that we can kind of assume that that's started and on track, we have to switch the core. We'll come back to that also, but we have to switch that core of what we're looking at away from the journey of and the development of Moses and start to look at the development of the people. And that involves Moses, right? Because as much as Moses' journey involves his relationship with the people's journey involves what Moses is doing. So the two are very much interconnected, but for a while here, we're going to be looking, for the rest of the book, in fact, we're going to be looking more prominently at the journey of the people, and Moses is a figure who relates to that. And we'll be kind of spot checking how Moses' relationship with God is developing and the effect it has, but we'll be emphasizing and really looking at what is the relationship of these people and God. So this lesson in this chapter has some reminder of the state of those people, right? We see how they respond to Moses and some of what that means and how that works, not well. We get a little bit of background and some of the genealogy and history of the people. We get an introduction of who God is and who he has been to them and who he will be to them. And we get an idea that Moses is still kind of unilaterally acting on their behalf because they can't be trusted to do it for themselves yet. But the frame is shifting away from Moses and toward the people. And that's important because this is where we begin the journey of the people toward God. Which unfortunately is never as successful as the journey of Moses toward God. So the two definitely they kind of run in parallel, but kind of not, right? Moses really gets it and goes all in and makes the whole journey. The people don't respond to Moses representing God the same way Moses responded to God. And so they don't get as far as Moses got. And while even Moses doesn't get all the way, he's not Jesus. He gets about as close as it's possible for a flawed human to be. And he tries to drag these people kicking and screaming there with him. But they're just as a people not willing to take the steps to get to where Moses has gotten. Although the opportunity presents itself constantly. And that's where, and there are a lot of things in Exodus that are, as we've talked about and will continue to, that are relevant to how we live our lives today. But that's one of the biggest ones, right? It's easy to look back at these people and say, these people are so dumb. God is right there, and he's done all of these things, and he's asking them to do this little bit, and all of these great things will happen, and how could they possibly miss that? And it's useful to have that frame in an external point of view, so we don't have to look quite as much internally when we're looking at that. But of course, we've been given more than they were ever given. We've been asked likewise to do what is involved in being the people of God. and the overwhelming majority of us also fail, or fail to live up to what that means and promises. So as we journey along with these mule-headed people in this study, our challenge is to, if I were to identify with and place myself in the shoes of a character in the study, it's not Moses, certainly. It's not Aaron. It's the people of Israel. And there are lessons in that for where they're missing. And the contrast between, we would hope that there's a comparison between Moses and the people, right? And they imitate Moses and they find their way to God. What we get instead is a contrast between Moses and the people, where they diverge, starting with Aaron and filtering all the way down. They routinely diverge from the example set and the pathway set by Moses. And it creates quite literally a much longer and more winding pathway to the promised land. And many other issues as well that we'll see. And of course, we're not meant to imitate Moses, we're meant to imitate Jesus Christ. And every place where we diverge from that also creates many, many extra steps and a much more winding journey on our pathway to the promised land as well, if we get there at all. So there's a lot here that is worth looking at, but we have to introduce the journey of the people starting here in this chapter so we can start that contrast between what is Moses doing and what are the people doing, and what should the people have been doing, and in the very rare case, what should Moses have been doing. So that's kind of setting the stage for our journey through the rest of this book, which is also an account of a journey toward the promised land as well. As we're shifting frames, we're re-anchoring what's going to happen, right? We know key thing about what's going to happen, right? Moses is going to go to Pharaoh, and eventually stuff will happen. Eventually Pharaoh will let them go, and the Israelites will despoil the Egyptians on their way out. And God was very sketchy about all the details between you ask Pharaoh to let my people go, he refuses, whatever that looks like, and eventually you leave. That middle point, the details were very sparse. Here, because we're looking at the point of view of a different character, not Moses, the people, their shift isn't the accounting of those events isn't you, Moses, are going to go talk to Pharaoh and he's going to say no, and some of that part of it, because that's not relevant to the people because they don't buy into that part at all. It just sort of happens from God's doing, like whether they want it to or not. What is relevant to them is their part of it. So now we're reframing that now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. For with a strong hand he will send them out. Yes, with a strong hand he will drive them out of his land. Whose land are we talking about? It's not God's, right? This is out of Pharaoh's land. God does something to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh is going to, in defeat, with his strong hand, drive out the people who wanted to leave anyway. So Moses' version is, you're going to go and you're going to despoil these people. The people's version is, Pharaoh is going to drive you out of the land. Because I, God, am going to do things to Pharaoh that make him do that. Note the shifting frame, right? Like the big picture of you leave captivity, by the intervention of God, the same. The details shift because the frame of reference that we're looking at it from shifts. That's why we're reintroducing a thing that we know, is because we're looking at it from a different point of view. So we're resetting that basic piece of information because we're resetting the frame. More resetting of the frame. Who have these people known God as? Who has God been to them? He has always been the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So we're not going to do that anymore, right? Like, we're going past that because that was the God of a couple of guys who were dead. As we've talked about, like, that's not the foundation to build on, right? Like, what is, if I'm Joe Schmo Israelite, all these hundreds of years later, what does the God of Abraham mean to me? I didn't know Abraham. Sure, he's my great whatever grandpa, but I never knew him. So what? And that relationship also relied on an intermediary, right? Like, if he's the God of Abraham and I want him to be my God, I have to go through Abraham, which again is problematic when Abraham is dead. Same with Isaac and Jacob. That worked when one of the patriarchs was alive, and even to an extent when Joseph was. When all of those guys are dead and you can't go to them to go to God, and that's who God is, it's no wonder the people have become more and more distant from God as they've become more and more distant from Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. That's not how to know God in a meaningful way. This is the thing we have to watch out for too, by the way, is when you put distance or intermediaries between yourself and God. Like, the whole Christianity thing is about tearing those down. But so is the founding of the people of Israel. God doesn't want intermediaries. He wants us coming to him directly. Anything that's in the middle is a problem. Anything that's not alive and accessible that's in the middle is a huge problem, because then suddenly your living religion in worship of the living God becomes a dead thing, right? And all of what happens as a result of that also occurs. We have a thing like that still happens, right? Example, in the last few generations of people in this country, the faith has generation over generation by and large gotten weaker, right? And a part of that is initially children's relationship with God goes through the intermediary of their parents. As God's relationship with his people initially went through the intermediary of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That worked with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob where they were alive. It works okay where the parent has a strong and vibrant faith as well. But when the parent is somebody who never really got it, him or herself, and is just going through the forms, then all of a sudden the child doesn't have access to God through like a live and dynamic example of a relationship with God. It's a dead and distant thing that is the intermediary between child and God. And so the child never gets to the point of forming his or her own live, dynamic, engaging relationship with God without the intermediary, because the intermediary is not sufficient to bridge the gap to God, because it's a dead thing, right? These people are in that same spot of this dead intermediary has not successfully bridged the gap between people and God. And so the more time has passed, maybe they're observing some of the forms, still being circumcised, going to mass on holidays, maybe Sundays still, but not really carrying it into much of the rest of your life. Parallels are there. it wasn't enough for the people to really be firmly anchored in the people of God, which is why God reintroduces himself and says, I'm not just, I'm your God, this is my name. We're not this Abraham or Isaac and Jacob thing. I am your God, you can come to me directly. So we're reframing again by reintroducing that idea of God's name, which is less important that it is God's name and more important that God is introducing himself directly instead of through those intermediaries. So we're doing that. God, relationship with the people, pull out those intermediaries. As we're doing that, though, there's a thing that existed with the intermediaries that you people inherit, which is this covenant, right? The Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob died. The covenant didn't, because God promised it, and he promised it to their descendants. It is binding through all generations. So you people, the reason you're getting to know God is still through the intermediary of these guys and the covenant that they built. But we've got to go beyond that, right? You want to inherit the covenant, you have to be the people of God, right? It was promised to Abraham because of Abraham's relationship with God. If you want to claim the terms of the covenant, you have to have that relationship with God. And then a very interesting phrase is used. So the covenant is an important, if you're a slave in Egypt and you're starting to think, I have a right to claim inheritance in the land of Canaan where I'm not a slave, that sounds pretty good if somebody will do all the work for you, which is what we're talking about having happen. Who's the one who forgot the covenant, right? The language here is, moreover, I have heard the groaning of the sons of Israel, whom the Egyptians hold in bondage, and I, God, have remembered my covenant. But who's forgotten the covenant? We occasionally see some viewing of God through human lens that is in some ways ridiculous, right? Like, God doesn't forget. That is not a thing that God is capable of doing. So God cannot remember in the sense of how we think about remembering, or even, call to mind a thing that wasn't, like, limited human brain. I don't hold all things that are relevant to me in my mind all the time. That's not how my brain works. So there is, at any given moment in time, a thing that I have called to mind. That's not, like, everything that is and exists in the mind and will of God, or it would cease to exist. If God didn't remember you, you wouldn't be. If God didn't remember his covenant, it wouldn't be. It would cease to exist. So, like, this is not, it's an interesting phrase, and it's a helpful way. It is a way that this ancient text is addressing a very real problem that still persists today, which is, if God loves me and cares about me, then why on earth would he let my current situation in life be bad? Does he not care about me? Did he forget about me? Whatever, right? If you're a slave and have been for a long time and you're supposed to be God's people, you could very justifiably be saying, well, what's going on? God must have forgotten what's going on. But for the people and for us, it's not always true that the best end outcome for us is to always avoid any kind of turmoil along the way. And so God can allow, God didn't do the bad things to Israel, right? He didn't make them slaves. They went to Egypt, Pharaoh made them slaves, God didn't intervene, right? There's a big difference. God wasn't like punishing here, at least. God wasn't punishing his people by inflicting slavery upon them, right? He just did nothing, and the consequences of their actions led them to slavery. And then they asked God, "Why would you do this to us?" Like we do that, right? Like we do a bad thing, a very predictable and expected consequence of the bad thing eventually happens, and it's, why, God, would you do this to me? And we're so confused. Not just you, like I do this and am confused by the fact that the very predictable outcome of my poor behavior led to a place where I am enslaved, and all of the other bad consequences that go along with those things. And the conversation with God is about, why on earth would you do this to me? And not about, whoops, why did I do this to me? And so it can seem like God forgot, right? And it can be framed that way. Again, we're framing where we're at now in terms of the view of the people who are thinking, oh, God forgot about me, and not, oh, I made a bunch of poor decisions for generations and squandered the opportunity in Egypt. And I ended up making decisions that led to my own slavery, and entirely through my own fault. And we don't go through that whole journey with the Israelites, but we know that their worship of God isn't what it should be, right? We know that has failed or dropped way off over time. We know there are pockets where it's good, like the midwives who refused to put to death children on Pharaoh's command. We know that there are people and some principles that have lasted, but we know a lot has fallen by the wayside as well. So who has forgotten the covenant and who isn't carrying out the terms of the covenant? It's not God. It's the people. But God is coming in and saying, hey, even so, you have been blowing it, but my covenant is stronger than you blowing it, and it's time for us to do something about you. And I'm going to intervene and right some of the wrongs of the consequences of your actions, right? That is a thing. We asked for that like it's no big deal, right? Like, I got myself into this mess and God should just come and fix it. There's a price to fixing it, right? As a Christian, that price looks like Jesus Christ on the cross. It's not a thing to ask lightly for God to come in and to fix our transgressions. It costs for God to do that. He will. That's the thing he does, right? He's going to do it here. And although we don't see the cost that we see later with Jesus Christ, and it is not lightly done that the Egyptians are removed from slavery, and it's not done without pretty immense human cost, mostly borne by the Egyptians. But there is a price. We'll get to it, but there's like a perpetual cost that even involves the Egyptian or the Israelites and their animals and everything that continues in perpetuity. It costs for God to deliver them from the situation they've gotten themselves into. We lose sight of that, right? Like we think, oh, God's all powerful, so I can just make a mess of things, and then I can say light a candle, and then it'll be fixed. And he'll come in, or say a novena, and he'll come in and fix it, right? And we treat it like, it doesn't have a cost to do that, but it always does, right? It's not that God couldn't do it without a cost. It's that the system is set up is one where a debt is owed and it has to be paid, where there's not justice. God doesn't bypass justice when he delivers us from our mistakes. He pays the debt that has been incurred. The point I'm making is Like the Israelites are so easy to say, oh, hey, God, you should get us out of this mess, right? And we can so easily get to a point, oh, God, hey, why don't you get me out of this mess? And we think, it's free. And it's so easy. It might be free to you, but it costs. And so we should not take it for granted or take it lightly that God might actually intervene on the things that are going on in our lives. It is a huge deal if he does. It is a huge deal if and when he does. He's bearing the cost that we've incurred for that to happen. It matters, and it's powerful and profound. Doesn't mean you shouldn't ask. You should ask, right? God wants to help deliver you and to build that relationship with you. He has gone to great lengths to be able to help you. But I think we get to a point sometimes where we take for granted that God can and might help with our situations, and we disconnect ourselves from the idea that there's a cost. I think it's possible to do that with parents too, right? Little kids who have no concept of like the idea of money or what might be involved in their parent in doing things that they want, also, have a whim and ask their parents for stuff, and also aren't, connecting that there might be some cost involved. So for us, I think the point is God wants us to bring these things to him, but don't get in the habit of you just make a mess and assume God's going to fix it, because it does have a cost to fix that, and you're asking God to bear it for you. It's much better to get to a point where we're not making lots and lots of mistakes that we want other people to clean up for us. There's one other point as well. This concept of memory is a powerful and a fascinating one liturgically, and is kind of the thing that underlies and makes anything that is liturgy possible. There is a set of rules in our world that govern like the existence of physical things, right? Two things can't occupy the same space at one time, right? That can't happen physically. The liturgy is entirely about more than one thing existing in one space at one time, right? In what seems to be a violation of how we think about things and how we understand things to work. And memory is one of the profound, you talk about God being like spiritually present in the Mass, right? The physical thing that is happening in the Mass is you have a priest on an altar, and you have some bread and some wine, and like there's the physical reality of what's happening, right? That is one layer of what's there and what's going on. Equally real and equally present is Jesus Christ and Calvary and heaven and angels and saints and all of the communion of the saints and many things that we don't see are equally present. It's one thing to say, oh, they're present in spirit, and that's not wrong, but that doesn't really convey the weight of what's happening, right? Those things are as present or possibly more so than what is physically present. One of the only ways that we as humans can even process the idea of multiple things being present in one space and one time is through the idea of memory, right? Memory collapses time in on itself, right? It makes the past present in the future, it makes the past present in the present alongside the present, right? So suddenly you have two things overlapping and coexisting at the same time in our minds, right? Which is a type and a form of how in the liturgy you can have present and not present collide and exist at the same time. That's not just a function of memory, but it's something that works not unlike memory works within our own minds. And so memory is a type of how things can become spiritually present in the Mass, and you can have two things occupy one space at one time, which is why we're called so much to memory during the Mass, right? Your participation in the Mass is part of that, is your memory of, you can't really remember Calvary because you weren't there and it's not a thing that you have a memory of, right? You can remember through information that's been passed down, but it's even then it's not your memory, right? But so the liturgy really is not your memory that is going on. It is, in a sense, God's memory that you're participating in. And God's memory doesn't work like yours because it makes present the thing, because he is existence itself. God's memory is making present the things from the past now, or the kingdom of heaven now, right? God is, by being mindful of those things as part of what's happening in the Mass, God is making them as present to us as the priest and the bread and the wine and the altar, and all of the physical things that we can see through an act very much like memory, but in the mind of God and not the mind of a human. All of those other things are made as present as the physical things that we can experience. So this idea of remembering the covenant, like God remembering things, is a liturgical act, right? Like, even if it's not like formalized and all of it's the fundamental essence of how liturgy works and functions. So God remembering his covenant is also like a liturgical thing that's happening, right? So it's also not just, oh, I forgot and now I remember. It's also God remembering his covenant is, now I am making this present to you, right? Like God remembers what happened, what Jesus Christ did at Calvary, and it makes it present to us in the Mass, right? It's not that God forgot and now it's, oh, now I remember. It's like, I'm now calling this into my mind in a different way as God, that makes it present to you people who are around, right? And so now you are participating in it even though you weren't there, and you are there even if you can't see it. God remembering his covenant is also not, oh, I've forgotten, now I remembered. It's instead, I'm bringing this forth in a way that it now is liturgically present for you as the people, and it's like being imposed upon you as the people as I am calling it forth. And so that would be the other way to look at this, but it's still worth, don't take for granted the stuff that God's doing for you, but there's a cool thing going on here with memory and liturgy as well. So God remembers his covenant and sends Moses to say, hey, yeah, I remember that, right? So let's do the things that I promised, that I'm now making present. Not I, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, but now I, the Lord, am going to do these things. And so Moses, just go tell him that, right? It'll all be great. And Moses does, and people don't listen because of their broken spirit and their cruel bondage. The psychology in the book of Exodus is really excellent. This is real, right? Like, you get worn down and beaten down and full of despair, and somebody comes and says they can make it. Like, at some point, you lose hope, and the idea that things can get better is just, no, that can't happen. Right? Like, and somebody comes, especially if somebody like Moses offering something too good to be true. But there's a reason hope is one of the three essential virtues, right? Hope is not, we've talked about this in other studies, but worth touching on here as well. since this is about hope or the lack thereof. Hope is not wishing, right? We treat hope like it's synonymous with wishing. Like, oh, I sure hope it rains later because my grass could use some water. That's no. You wish that. You would like, I hope I win the lottery. Yeah, no, you wish you win the lottery. Hope is not a wish. Hope is an expectation. If you wish you will win the lottery, you might or might not buy a ticket. You might just have the fantasy about it and end it there. What would I do if I won? I sure wish I'd win the lottery. You might not even buy a ticket. But even if you buy a ticket, you're definitely continuing. You're not quitting your job, right? You're continuing your more normal routine, and you're holding your ticket because you don't expect that it wins, right? If you expect hope to win the lottery, you buy one ticket and you go tell your boss, I quit because I bought this lottery ticket, before the results are announced, because you expect to win. That would be crazy to do with the lottery, but that is precisely what we're asked to do with heaven, right? We are told you are going to heaven, and we are asked to go all in on that before we get to heaven. And if you don't, then you won't. It is a precondition of the idea of making it that far that you expect to make it that far. And to get that kind of expectation, you need a tremendous amount of trust, which is faith. Faith is also not belief. The core concept of faith is one of trusting and not of believing. And so these people have neither faith, they don't trust Moses at all, or hope. They certainly have no expectation that they're going to be able to be delivered from this. And so Moses comes and talks to them, and nope, we don't care. You can't do that. Like, they're not on board. These people have no faith, no hope right now. They don't know God either, right? Like Moses says, God is saying, and you shall know, I'll do these things and you will know that I am the Lord, right? God went to Moses and said, hey, I'm going to do you want a sign? Great. Like, I'll do all these things, and then this is how it'll be after the fact. There's your sign. And Moses said, cool, sign me up. The same thing comes to the people. I'm going to do all these things, and then you will know that I'm God. And they say, yeah, no, you're not. Like, no, I'm not buying it. The same, and this is where we start to see that divergence, right? Same proposition, more or less, made to Moses and to the people. Moses says, where do I sign up? If very reluctantly. And the people say, yeah, pass. The interesting thing is, because Moses signed up, the people don't have to, right? Like, they still get the benefit of what God's trying to do because Moses signed up, right? The faith of one man is enough to save from slavery the whole nation. Where have we heard that before, right? Moses is very much a type of Christ in this, right? The fidelity of Jesus Christ is also enough to bring pathway to salvation to all of us, even though we likewise are saying, I'd rather not. So big deal here. People are very much not on board. So poor Moses, this is not how he thought this was going to go, right? He thought he was going to go tell the Israelites, hey, God let me know that he's going to get you out of this mess. And they would say, oh, Moses, that's so wonderful. We're on board. And that hasn't happened. So step one, very much not going the way Moses might have had in mind. Then God says, doesn't matter what they said. Go tell Pharaoh to let them go. The plan is fine the way it was. It doesn't matter what they think. Just go ahead and go represent them to Pharaoh without their consent. It'll be fine, Moses. Don't worry about it. And Moses says, my own people, the ones who stand to, or at least the ones who stand to benefit from this, aren't listening, why would the one who stands to lose from this whole idea listen any more than the ones who stood to benefit from it are? It's a really fair point, Moses. Except he doesn't say. The interesting thing about this is, I don't think this is an excuse on the part of Moses, right? We just got through, he had all these excuses about, I'm slow of speech, and, I can't really speak in public, and I get nervous and whatever, and and I don't want to do it. That was before. Now, I'm a man of uncircumcised lips. I don't feel like that's saying the same thing, right? It's about speech, but the first one was very much listing, it was an excuse, right? It was listing any reason he could think of why this wasn't going to work. He's not here saying no. He's saying, God, I don't get it, right? How is Pharaoh going to listen to me when they wouldn't? And, clearly my talking isn't working very well. Like, there's something, like, I hear you, God, say it, and I'm like, yeah, this is great. And then I say it to people, and they're like, and so clearly the breakdown, Moses is now attributing himself as the breakdown, right? He's thinking, God, if you were talking about this, all these people would be on board, because, I've heard you talk about it, and you're great at that. And I'm all in, by the way, but like, it doesn't translate when, I try to do it. The breakdown is my fault, but like, it's not. This version seems to be acknowledging the greatness of God and is a humility on the part of Moses, and not like excuse. I know the difference is kind of subtle. He's also not saying no, right? The previous one, it sure read like he was saying no, right? God said, go talk to Pharaoh. And he said, I can't speak in public. Here, go talk to Pharaoh. I don't understand how he's going to listen to me. Who would listen to me? Similar but different things, right? And the perspective shift matters. At this point, Moses is close enough to all in. He's left his home. He's already gone through what he was so sure was going to be a horrible and embarrassing experience in front of the Israelites. It was. It's fine. He lived. It's okay. Moses is really having to get outside of his comfort zone here, but he's not like getting psyched out and nervous about the idea of talking to Pharaoh and being, I can't do that because I can't do that. It's his perspective has shifted. From a practical point of view, I suppose this happens in our lives as well, right? Like, you have to be trying to do what God wants you to do in your life for this to happen. So I'm not sure it happens to everybody all the time, because I don't think everybody is necessarily trying hard enough to follow God all the time to be regularly stepping outside of their comfort zone, right? Like, the first step is there's this little voice that says, here's the thing that makes you deeply uncomfortable, you should do it. And you say, yeah, no, here are 18 reasons why that won't work. And a lot of people stop there, right? And so you never know what could have been, because the voice of God came in suggesting a course of action, and you let your own discomfort and insecurity stop you from trying. If you try, most of the time, even if the worst thing that you could imagine in what God asked you to do happens, example for Moses, he goes and tells the Egyptians or the Israelites that God talked to him and he wants to deliver them from captivity. And they say no, and the text doesn't say they laughed in his face, but they clearly think that the idea is preposterous, right? That was Moses' worst fear in doing that, right? He enunciated to God, what if I go and talk to them and they don't believe me or listen to me? And God said, oh, don't worry about it. But Moses was very worried about it. And then that's exactly what happened. But it wasn't how Moses thought it would be, right? Like, because afterwards he's not like, God, I'm so mortified that that just happened. How could you do that to me? It wasn't what he thought it would be when it happened. And he doesn't really seem fazed by the fact that they all said no to him, right? Like, it's not like, I can't do that again with Pharaoh because that was so humiliating. It was, okay, we tested this. There's a problem here where if they didn't listen, like, we can go do that, but I don't understand how Pharaoh is going to listen based on what we just saw. Moses' perspective shifted immensely because he did the thing that made him uncomfortable and that God was asking him to do. And in so doing, he learned something about God and something about himself. He grew as a person and he grew in his relationship with God. Contrast, the same opportunity came to the Israelites to participate in something that brought them out of their comfort zone and gave them the ability to grow closer to God. And they said, no thanks. Important divergence point, right? Moses is still in and still walking on the path God wants him to walk on. The people are still saying, no thanks. And that's going to be a pretty common trend. For us, when you do the uncomfortable things that God is trying to get you to do, even if the thing happens sort of the way that you feared it was going to, when you get there and on the other side of it, it's still not the same as what you thought it was. And you still come out of it better than you went into it, even if every one of your fears about the situation come to pass. It still doesn't happen the way you were afraid about it, and you still end up in a better place on the other end. So Moses grows as a person, is better equipped now God gave him a practice run, right? He has more confidence going in to Pharaoh now, because he knows, even if Pharaoh laughs at me, like they did, okay. But God, I just don't understand how this is going to work, but yeah, we can do that again. Okay, let's see what happens. I'm kind of interested in what you're going to do too. Versus the people, not doing it. Nope, pass. When those opportunities come, and they will if we're trying to live a life consistent with God and follow God, the challenge is to not get in our own heads and let our own fears and anxieties keep us from responding to what God wants us to do. And you can go a couple rounds. Moses did, right? Like, I couldn't possibly. But even when he's doing that, he's open enough that, the psychology thing again, right? His head's in the way of his heart, and he's throwing out these fears and anxieties, and God keeps saying, we'll work with that. Oh, Aaron can do that. Okay, we've got a way to do this. And even if it's not ideal, God can work with it, and it gets to where it needs to go. For Moses, doesn't end up so well for the people. But if the people had signed on the way they were invited to, it wouldn't have mattered that Aaron was the intermediary, right? Aaron's not the only one who blows it. The people, all the people do as well. So Aaron is not uniquely culpable. He's just not Moses. Moses is uniquely not culpable. And that's not enough we'll see. The people still get to the promised land, but it's very roundabout and incomplete in what's executed. And Jesus ultimately gets us there all the way. But you will never get there unless you do better than these people did. right? Like the opportunities are there, but you have to be like Moses and not like the Egyptians, or you will not get to the promised land. Now we get to the most engaging part of the Old Testament, a genealogy. There is in these always buried something relevant and kind of interesting. They're still, especially if you're lecturing, no fun to get to. But there's a reason that they're there every time they're there. And it's worth a little bit of time and effort and thought spent. Maybe not a ton. In this case, what's important is the farthest back person mentioned in each line, Reuben and Simeon, especially as the firstborn of Israel, right? Genealogies go, the first son tends to be the most important one, right? So we're setting that one up, and there were how many sons of Israel? How many tribes? There were 12, and there was a daughter, but nobody cares about her. That's not really true, but she doesn't make the lists, right? Dinah. In this case, however, we're going to see there are a lot of the 12 that we don't care about. There is an agenda here that we'll get to, but it's starting normally, right? Birth order, you got on the sons, you trace some genealogies. This is any other genealogy you'd see. You've got your Reuben, you've got your Simeon. And then you've got 10 more to go. Strangely, if you've looked ahead in the chapter, we don't have entirely genealogy, so something unusual is going to happen. This first part, though, is very usual. Picking up, then, we are at our third son, Levi. And that's the last one we're going to do. The other 9... meh. So there is an emphasis in this particular section in the book of Exodus on the tribe of Levi. Why might that be in a book that has to do with Moses and Aaron and, the founding of the priesthood and all of that? Again, if you care about where the book came from and the different sources of authorship and some of that might have come into play in this, it's not surprising that some parts of the Torah focus very much on the house of Judah, when some of this could have been assembled along the time of the kings who were of the line of Judah, and some of it could be emphasizing the line of Judah, which could have been written, or the line of Levi, which could have been written by priests who also had some claim to lineage, authority, and power. It's not a surprising thing that people could emphasize the history of what is relevant to their particular position and claim if they're the ones writing it. And that's not even a bad thing to do, right? Origin stories and histories are helpful for understanding how we got to where we are. But this is very pro Levi, and we'll see, has bearing on an interesting thing that is happening in Exodus, which we'll get to in the next little bit. I won't get ahead of us. But for now, relevant part, we get through Reuben, Simeon, we get to Levi. We're going to go more generations deep in Levi by a lot, and we're not going to get to the people after Levi. Another thing these genealogies do is as they dive down, they dive deeper, right? We cut off, if it's a tree, as we go down a branch, we look at everything on the current branch and then we take one path. And then we look at everything on the current branch and then we take one path, right? So what we're doing is we're going down the tree from Jacob, Israel, to, we'll see. As you look at these genealogies as a tree with different points of branching and all of that. The relevant thing here that's happening is at every level you go, you're only following one branch. Then you're looking at everything that's there, then you're following the next branch. So you've got Jacob as the trunk. And then from Jacob, you start with your branches until you get to the one that you want. Cool, Levi. Where does that go? Branches. Pick one. Where does that go? Right? And you're narrowing your focus. So instead of expanding out and having your whole tree that you go through, which sometimes these genealogies do, this one is very laser focusing toward a goal that we'll see, and it's a very interesting goal in light of the book of Exodus. We've gotten to the branch, the sub-branch that is like the Moses-Aaron block, right? And that family here, and developed things around that. And then we'll see shortly a very interesting thing happens. So what is the interesting thing that happens? We get to the Moses-Aaron block of the tree. Remember, we're pruning out or not following the less important people. You'd think, Moses is such a big deal, we're going to take that Moses branch and see where it goes. And instead, we take the Aaron one. There are a few reasons involved in that. One, Aaron is actually the older son. So from a birthright and a genealogy point of view, he has the better claim. But we know it's not just that, because we skipped over Reuben and Simeon to get to Levi. So you can take not the first if it's relevant. So it's not just that. It's not because Aaron's closer to God. We're pretty sure of that, and if there's any doubt, stay tuned for a little while. 3, priests are a thing, and the priesthood is a thing. Between Moses and Aaron, only one of them becomes a priest, and there is a hereditary priesthood that forms, and it is not Moses, it is Aaron. So this is the roots and foundation of the priesthood. But this is also then like legitimizing the priesthood, right? If you're looking at it from a hereditary point of view, Aaron and the priesthood is more important than Moses, because the patriarchs all had hereditary promises, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Even Joseph, his lineage was split into 2 half tribes because he was so pleasing to God and got like a double share. But that's not relevant to Joseph on earth. That's relevant to his heritage. So for all the patriarchs, their descendants mattered as much as they did. Moses is the first really big figure where that's not true. We don't care about Moses' sons from a point of view of what happens. The hereditary part of what Moses does is passed through Aaron. And it's because Moses refused it, right? God said, hey, Moses, you should go talk to Pharaoh for me. And Moses said, can't do it. And God said, okay, Aaron will do it for you, and you'll work through him. And that started a pathway that led to Aaron being the priest and not Moses, right? You split responsibility, which in Moses' lifetime mostly worked out not that badly, but set a precedent that was worse down the road. But it also meant that Aaron's sons become important in a way that Moses' sons aren't, because the priesthood is the hereditary part. Prophets aren't hereditary. Moses is very much and every bit a prophet, but you don't pass being a prophet down to your son. Only in one case do you pass on being a prophet to anybody at all, and that's Elijah and Elisha, and that's an extraordinary series of events. And it's not like the big part of that passing along still happened by God and not by Elijah. Right? It just so happened that God called them both, and he did the thing he did. But you don't pass on being a prophet. So what Moses has is a whole new thing that is not hereditary. And in that regard, it actually is helpful for conceptualizing what a prophet is, that the priesthood is separated. The problem is Aaron doesn't have the relationship with God that Moses does. So if Moses had been the priest, or if Aaron had had faith like Moses, then you'd have been in a different place. But as it is, you separated out, on the one hand, the guy who actually has the relationship with God, and on the other hand, the priesthood. And unfortunately, it stays that way. The priesthood gets off to a very rocky start, and it's never a whole lot better than that. And it can still be challenging. Priests without a relationship with God create problems for the church and for the faithful. They did back then, they do now. The church might be infallible, but priests are not necessarily, right? God's covenant was infallible, or was not violable back then, right? It was firm, but for his people, but any individual person or generation could disinherit itself from the covenant and could meet consequences of not following it, and leave the next generation to fix what they got wrong, and the current generation is screwed, for lack of a better word. So the priests messing up and misleading the people, like, started a cycle where God kept coming back and having to lead his people back to his covenant for as long as he was willing to put up with that. But so the covenant was intact, but individual priests and individual generations met with massive devastation as a result of not following the covenant and the priests not being able to get it done. In the same way, our church is infallible and has this core that is rooted in God, that is and always will be incorruptible, beautiful and perfect. But you can have human manifestations of it in the priesthood that are very much not that, that cause that don't corrupt what the church is, but corrupt individual parts of it, right? It's a thing, it's an incredible responsibility to be a priest. Not just talking about the obvious issues of the whole abuse scandal that we had in this country and all of that, although that's of course the most obvious. Being a priest would be a tremendous responsibility. And it has to be rooted in that firm relationship with God. And blessedly, we have many very holy priests as well, that set beautiful examples for us all. The Israelites were less lucky in that regard. We're better off than they are, generally. We meet very few good priests. Along the way, through the Old Testament, there are some. They're bright and shining stars amidst a sky mostly full of darkness. But hereditary priesthood is a very important thing for a while. Eventually, when that's not working very well, other institutions start springing up, including judges and kings and more prophets when the kings aren't working very well, and finally God himself. New things keep happening and adjusting around that wouldn't have to happen if the old things got it right. This is the first try, right? As a people, you've got priests, and they're meant to be the intermediaries between God and his people, and to help strengthen and create that relationship. But when there is a law in metaphysics that in Latin it's nemo dat quod non habet, nothing can give what it doesn't have. If you're trying to be an intermediary to help lead the people to a relationship with God, and you don't have one, you can't do that. And that starts with Aaron, and then you get to a problem how do Aaron's sons here get to it if they're not getting it from their dad? And it's hereditary, so they didn't get it from Aaron. Their sons don't get it from them because they don't have it from the beginning. That relationship with God isn't there for the priests to get from other priests or to give to the people. They're serving a thing that they don't have, and it's not possible. And it leads to, we'll see, it's the first stage of the problems that these people have are because of that. Until we shift into other people having problems, like the king, nobody else gets it a lot better, right? The kings don't exactly get it better than the priests, with a few bright, shining exceptions, but there are those exceptions with the priests as well. So anyway, that's a long way to say the priesthood is emphasized here instead of Moses. And that's probably a matter of the perspective of who's writing the book, if you care about such things, or it's actually more relevant to the immediate future of these priests from a hereditary and a lineage point of view, because we don't care about Moses' line, and we do about Aaron's. Sometimes genealogies end this way as well. You know, in case you were confused about which Moses and Aaron these were, the context of the book, you probably weren't, but just in case, this Moses and Aaron that we were talking about are the ones who did the thing that we're talking about, just in case you missed it. By way of transition and summary, then, we're wrapping up the key point, which makes sense. That's definitely the part we talked the most about here in this video as well. And is fairly the big point of emphasis on all of this. We're leaving it as God said to Moses, okay, Israelites, not buying it, go tell Pharaoh. And Moses again reiterating, how is Pharaoh going to listen to me? But he's going to go talk to Pharaoh. And like that's the tension question, right? If we're building drama, like how is Pharaoh going to listen to Moses? Like it doesn't make sense that Pharaoh would listen more than the Israelites did, right? It is a legitimate question that's hard to have a lot of tension with in this book, because we all know enough of the story that, like, spoiler, but there are 10 plagues, and then like Pharaoh lets the people go because of the plagues, right? But if you didn't know that, right? At some point, somebody read this for the first time and didn't already know that. In that event, this is a cliffhanger, right? Like, this is a cool way to end off a section right before Moses goes to talk to Pharaoh. The point is that we're invited to be reflecting on is, oh yeah, how is that going to work? That can't possibly, that's crazy. There's no way. It's a neat end that we gloss right over the tension building for, because it's really hard to feel tension when you know the story, or even sort of know the story. But it's an important question, and it'll be a good thing to bear in mind when we get into Moses going to talk to Pharaoh. How on earth is that going to work? This has been an overview of Lesson 6 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study, You Shall Have No Other Gods, the Book of Exodus. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.